Good morning, everybody. It is so great to be here. I'm Luiza Savage. I'm executive editor for growth at Politico, which is a global news organization that focuses on politics and policy. And we are so proud at Politico to be the media partner on this event. I hope you are all reading our amazing coverage in the Ottawa Playbook, which is our morning newsletter on politics and policy. And I had the privilege of building Politico Canada a few years ago. And our editor, Sue Allen, is here, and what she and her team have built over the last few years is just truly astonishing and amazing, and we're so proud. Yes, big hand for Sue. If you're a fan of Ottawa Playbook, thank you so much from the bottom of our heart. So I'm also a recovering Canadian journalist, formerly with Maclean's and the National Post. And it's really great to be back in Toronto, especially since I flew in really late last night in a time machine. I found an article from my early days at the National Post. And I'll read you the headline. It says, "Falling farther behind," quote, "productivity gap. Chrétien liberals plan policy offensive to catch US." So there's my time machine. The date on that article was June 16th, 2001. That's 23 years we've been having this conversation. I think that's amazing, and I really appreciate Ed Greenspan's ambition to settle it today, once and for all. So one tiny thing before I introduce our panel, I looked at that article. It was 5,000 words. It was kind of amazing. One notable stat, 40% of the US productivity growth in the US came from one sector that was only 6% of the economy, and that was the computer and technology sector. I think that's just an interesting thing to keep in mind, given what's going on in Washington today. And what's going on in Washington today is an extreme sense of urgency. And it is being driven not by the notion of productivity, but it is being driven by the notion of maintaining economic supremacy in the face of competition from China. And what that is resulting in is hundreds of billions of dollars of investment in microchips through the CHIPS Act and other kinds of high-tech manufacturing, particularly around clean energy, through the Inflation Reduction Act. So I just give you that as you're thinking forward to the next 23 years, what that comparison might look like in terms of the huge amount of investment going into industries that are likely to drive productivity growth in the United States and what the implications could be for the comparative gap with Canada. So with that, I'd like to introduce our amazing panel. We're focused today on the role of the private sector, and we have some truly exceptional private sector leaders here, and I'll introduce them briefly. They have huge biographies. Ehren Cory is the CEO of the Canada Infrastructure Bank. And prior to joining the bank, he served as CEO of Infrastructure Ontario and was a partner at McKinsey & Company in Toronto. Dr. Victoria Lee is president and CEO of Fraser Health, as well as holding professorships at UBC and SFU. And she's also worked internationally with the United Nations Development Program and the World Bank. And next to me is Murad Al-Katib. He's president and CEO of AGT Food, which is a billion-dollar company that he started in 2001. And they produce value-added pulses and other staple foods for the global market. But before we hear from them, I want to stir it up just a little bit, and I want to pulse you in the audience with a question. So please raise your hand. Who thinks that Canada's productivity gap is a failure of government policy? Okay, so I would say, like, I don't know, maybe 15, 20%. Who thinks it is a failure of private sector leadership? Very good. I'd say the majority. Who doesn't think it's a problem? All right, great. So this is where we're going to start. I'd like to ask our panel, starting with Ehren, is the productivity gap a failure of public policy, or what is the blame here on the private sector?
I'm surprised more people just didn't leave their hands up. I think the answer is yes in many ways. But I just want to say you gave Ed credit. I would like to go back. Why didn't you organize this panel and have the three of us here in 2001? If you really wanted to solve the challenge, maybe we would have gotten to the bottom of it as we're about to in these next 25 minutes. I think the answer is yes. I think meaning I think it's a failure on both sides. I think part of that is Canadian specific and part of it is just the world. The Canadian specific part, we have to recognize what our incredible strengths are, but also our limitations. Like this is very basic, okay? But we're a big country and we're a trading nation, and our geography gives us all of our is an incredible source of strength in our clean energy and in the natural resources that it gives us access to. But it also creates a massive initial barrier we got to overcome if we're going to be more productive. We got to be connected both digitally and physically with good transit, with good trade corridors, with good internet connectivity. So I think government has a bigger role than on average, I would say, in Canada, just given our starting point as a country that is vast and has incredible resource opportunity, but needs to be a trading nation. So public policy plays a huge role, I think, in productivity. And I think that the private sector, and Murad will talk more about this, I'm sure, but the level of innovation, ambition, and boldness we see in our private sector's willingness to invest, and maybe whether we have the incentives right to help them do that is a great question. But the bottom line is our private sector does not seem to be taking the types of bold investments, especially in capital stock, that drives productivity. And so yes, that's the two sides of the equation as far as I see it.
Victoria?
Thanks so much. I'll do a very Canadian thing and agree. And
I told them not to agree.
but I think it is both, right? And I think it's difficult to say it's one versus the other. It is both. I do think, when I look at health, there's so many opportunities in terms of productivity and innovation. And what often happens with Canadian companies that they actually can't grow their companies in Canada because of difficulty actually entering the market in Canada. So what happens? They go to the US or other markets, and then they're able to come back.
And the difficulty being regulation, red tape, what do you?
I think it's the policies, procurement, and ability to actually enter the market. The barriers are very high.
Okay.
I think on the public side, there's also lack of decision making. It's a very Canadian thing to do. We spread across, but don't make a decision on where we're going to actually focus. So that'll be interesting to see with the $2.5 billion that's coming in for AI. On the private sector, I think there's lack of imagination, collaboration in making those bold moves. We don't have the size of the capital that we need to actually be able to compete in the global market. So I think there's competition that's important, but collaboration that's especially important in the Canadian private sector that's different.
And Murad, I know you'll be speaking more on this tonight. What do you think what's the relative role here of public policy versus private sector?
I think that one of our problems and challenges is that government sees it as a role to improve this, and when they intervene, in a lot of cases of the private sector, what we want them to do is set the general environment and then get out of our way. And I think that the constant a failure that we've had in this area is that government policy is trying to fix it, and in essence, the regulatory burden is part of the reason why we have a productivity gap. So I'm going to, assign a great apportionment of blame to the overall environment in our country. The private sector, though, I think that what we have to recognize is not just the companies themselves, but I think there's a general failure of the capital, markets within the Canadian system, where if I look in particular at the last decade, I see so many, capital providers and so many capital markets players wanting to go into an asset-light mode and yet be globally successful. We need to recognize that Canada is a producing nation and one that has to export. I mean, we've got 37 million people, and we produce billions and billions of dollars of productive economic output. That means we need to invest. We need to invest in machinery. We need to go asset-heavy. We need to go into productive production capacity linked to supply chains. And that's what we haven't been doing in this country. I always say if I was Prime Minister for a day, I would invest $100 billion in trade infrastructure because it would pay for generations and generations to come. But we're trying to fix things on election cycles, which are really 2 years' time.
Right.
And on that side, I think there's a collective blame that's really failing the system quite miserably.
So you're all CEOs, you're in a leadership position. What is the role of the CEO in driving Canadian productivity? And do you even measure productivity or think about productivity within your organization at the sort of more micro level?
Dr. Lee, you want to go first?
Oh, sure. I think incredibly important in terms of leadership. I'm just going to set a little bit of the context because healthcare in Canada, of course, is not private, it's public. It's a public organization that I'm leading, looking at health. Often it's seen as a cost center. It's a cost center that spends money, but when we think about it, health is actually wealth. And it's an industry globally that's responsible for about $11 trillion and over 10% of GDP. And especially now in the time and urgency of transformation that's required in health, there's huge opportunities for us to look at how can we actually increase our productivity, but how do we actually introduce more wealth through our health? And I think there's a number of pieces there. One is around data. And PPF, actually, there's how do we liberate health data for not only better health overall, but also for productivity. And around that, I think data around, it's our data being our currency. And in health, we're very wealthy in terms of that currency with health. And I think we're just not using it, mobilizing it, giving it to the users, as well as integrating it across the system to mobilize the impact of data that we can generate.
What's stopping you? You're the CEO.
Legislation, but I think there's an opportunity. I think if we actually empower the data to go to individuals, users, then we can get there. And we're underway in terms of the work that we're doing in Fraser, for instance. You're absolutely right. We're creating digital twin across the whole system to be able to mobilize that data so that not only individual level decision making, but system level decision making can occur. So I think the vision is very important. I think engagement of our teams, very, very important around that productivity because as you mentioned, how do you actually measure productivity? It's easy to say labor productivity. In health, it's very complex. I would say it's not just a widget per or number of dollars per. It's really around quality improvement. And that quality improvement measure, I think, and productivity, we don't measure it accurately and we don't measure it well. And I think that's part of the work that's required. And I think when I'm talking about engaging our teams and workforce, 80% of costs in healthcare is the people that we're investing in. And again, I think it's an investment that'll actually mobilize growth in the future because of the potential, especially with technology and digital transformation underway. And that workforce engagement, I think what we need to pay attention to more and more is not only retention, recruitment, and redesign of our health services, but really reimagination of our healthcare teams as we look at technology augmentation as well. And I would say just one more thing around that is driven by, it's easy to be values, purpose-driven in the healthcare industry, but I think there's also a bit around intergenerational workforce engagement and how do we compel, engage workforce in the state that we're in when there's very different value systems that are crashing and converging.
Every company is dealing with that, absolutely.
Exactly.
So you said creativity, you said innovation, you said data. Murad, you have this distinction of having worked in government policy before becoming an entrepreneur. From your sort of dual perspective, what is the role of the CEO in driving Canadian productivity, and how do you measure it within your organization?
I think that the key thing as a CEO is you have to really define what productivity means to your organization. And, again, we sometimes get caught in definitions of, how do we make gains? What's our unit costs? I mean, to me, productivity in our organization is, how do we pick our niche? How do we scale it? And how do we meet the need of the actual person or the consumer that's willing to pay a price for the good or service that we produce that we can make money at?
Well, you said scale. I know this is something really important to you. Can you just say, very briefly, what is the opportunity and what's holding Canada back from scaling? Because that's really, if you're going to grow the revenue per person working.
Well, listen, I mean, far too long in Canada, I have a little anecdote. I always say, you can either be dinner or you can be a diner, right? And I want to be a diner. I don't want to be dinner. I don't want somebody to just eat me. I want to be big enough that we can eat other companies and become big in scale. And that's not kind of the ambition of Canadians. To me, productivity in our organization, if I look at how AGT started in the basement of my house and became $3 billion, we invested in machinery, we invested in technology, equipment on niche crops. We gave a competitive outlet for farmers to grow lentils and peas and chickpeas. It became a multi-billion-dollar industry because we transformed it and we met the needs of a customer in an emerging market and we made money doing it.
And you're looking at it not just as a commodity, but you're moving up.
I mean, at the end of the
value.
day, we're feeding, quality protein food and staples to the world. And, again, when I look at agriculture and I look at the opportunity, it's a sector where we've actually showed gains in productivity and gains in economic output. When I chaired the National Strategy Table, we set a target to increase agricultural exports to 85 billion from 45 billion within a 5-year period, and we met the target at year 3. How many sectors of our economy deliver $40 billion of new export in a 3-year period? So tangible. And what it is it's early adopters of technology at the farm level, right? Digitization, sensors, data collection, analytics, AI, it's all at the farm. We take it, we transform it, and we meet the need of a consumer. And that creates wealth. So our sector is kind of an example where people are starting to wake up and recognize that agriculture ain't the family farm anymore. And there's a lot of opportunity. So that's kind of how we try and take it to our organization and make people realize that feeding the world, profit and purpose alignment is how we can scale our business. That's productivity to me.
I love it. Ehren, you've said that Canada lags, quote, brutally behind in capital investment, which we know is a key driver of productivity growth, because I read the PPF papers on this. So why is that, and what will it take to change it?
Well, I think two things. Yeah, I think some of the points that both Dr. Lee and that Murad have mentioned are at the heart of it, because capital investment does require scale. Like, they're chunky things. You can't spend a couple dollars a day on it forever. You got to make big decisions and make major investments, and they happen in step changes. I think that the key to that is twofold. One, I agree with Murad that it starts from having a lot of clarity. So clarity in market rules, clarity in pricing. Think of the places we need to make investment now. Energy transition, for instance. And if you look at what's happening right now in our country, I would say that there's a lot of millions of really smart, really motivated, really focused people who are blending between purpose, mission, decarbonizing our economy, decarbonizing our electricity grid, et cetera. They have a purpose, and they want to grow a business and make money while doing it, and that's great. What they need is a real clarity of the rules of the game they're playing in, how global markets are going to work, and we're stuck right now in a really tricky spot. So I think the thing government can do, and that's something at the CIB, because we're a Crown corporation, what we try and do is just give real clarity of the playing field that we're in. How would we invest money? What are the decisions? How do we make our decisions? And I think that's what all of us who are in public policy, I dabble, but what many people in this room in it more than I, who are focused on public policy, they're thinking about how do we create that landscape. That's number one. I don't think people can make big bets, make big investments without clarity of the rules. And Dr. Lee talks about AI, the same thing, data privacy. When I say rules, or the playing field has to at least be clear. Then people can make good decisions.
That's right. So not even one word, one letter answer. What grade would you give the Canadian private sector when it comes to making capital investments that drive productivity and competitiveness?
Well, I spent the first half of my answer saying what the public sector needs to do. I didn't even criticize the private sector, but I will just say that if we don't have more, the combination of ambition, scale, and capital formation, Murad talked about where our money is going, we can create all the level playing field we want and we'll still lose.
So
I would give
grade.
it a C.
All right.
Minus.
All right. So Victoria, another driver of productivity, according to the PPF, is technology.
Yeah.
So artificial intelligence is being cited as the technology that can completely transform labor productivity going forward. And healthcare is cited as one of the sectors that could most quickly benefit from the advent of AI. So how confident are you that Canadian companies will seize this moment to genuinely vault ahead as opposed to falling behind other countries?
So I'll answer it multiple ways. One is that absolutely, in terms of transformation potential, technology is the catalyst for us to get there. As much as I adore capital, and we've got a lot of capital development underway, we're not going to be able to build our way out of the health system challenges that we're under, because it's $1 million per bed for long-term care, $10 million per bed for acute care, and demographic and epidemiological shifts require us to actually provide care and quality care in a much more integrated way, and that digital transformation AI will actually give us for Canada about 8% additional productivity and even up to 40% behind the house type of productivity. So going to your question of are Canadian private companies taking advantage of that? They're trying, I would say, and I think it does relate to can they actually raise enough capital in the Canadian setting? Because what I see over and over again, we're great at research and innovation and startups, so we get all these wonderful minds and brilliance coming together to come up with solutions. They cannot penetrate our market. Health is especially risk averse when it comes to actually innovation and change, and meant to be because of the individual care that we provide, but we don't have to apply the same level of scrutiny when it's behind the scenes or middle of the house kind of. There's a lot of administration operations that goes behind the scenes that we can also innovate. But in terms of being able to do that, the private companies that try to do that are not able to raise capital in Canada that match what they can get in the US. Very quickly will be bought out if there's any potential, unless they are just wanting to stay for Canada just because of the fact that they want to be Canadian companies. So I think there's a lot of willingness, a lot of brilliance, a lot of startup, but that scale comes to play over and over again.
It's a theme we're hearing over and over. So very quickly, what letter grade would you give Canadian private sector or the Canadian healthcare sector more broadly, since as you mentioned you're public, when it comes to moving quickly to adopt AI right now for productivity and competitiveness?
I would say D+, and it's because we're 20 years behind the best in healthcare in terms of technology and where things are at. And I think overall in Canada, only 5% of organizations have actually adopted AI. So
how many?
5%.
5%.
So there's incredible opportunity I think we have, and we need to move quickly.
Great, thank you. And Murad, obviously to meet all of these challenges we've just been discussing, how do you think, as someone who has built so much in a short period of time, how do you think the Canadian business culture needs to change?
I think it's interesting as Canadians, we talk about, the advantage of our culture, and I think we do have an advantage. I think that, one disadvantage I'm seeing very, very prevalently around the world is that, as Canadians, we are known as quite, nice and passive, and we're all, great people, and I love that about Canada. At the same time, what I want to do is take those advantages of the way we think about our employees, the way we think about health and safety, the way we think about environmental sustainability, climate change, and I want to make that our advantage, right? We ultimately are not, enough. It's that mentality, as I say, why is it enough to start a business and say, I'd love to get big enough so somebody can buy me, right? I mean, that's just not the mentality that I want to see out of our next generation. And, when I look at that, one thing I always say to entrepreneurs is you have to find investors and capital sources that support the vision of scaling. If you look at us, we were a TSX traded company. We thought that the Canadian and the North American institutional investors were the wrong investors for our company. So we partnered with Fairfax and OMERS, and we went private, and we're now scaling our business in emerging markets because our capital providers are backing that strategy. So overall, I would say that the entrepreneurs and the business community in Canada, I'm going to give them a C-. And the C-, I think, is, in certain sectors, we're doing our job well. I think in this country, we should recognize we are not going to be good at everything. And our challenge in this country is we have this mentality in government, in industry associations, that we should sprinkle a little bit of fairy dust on everybody and hope that everything's going to be okay. And 24 years later, it's not okay. So let's pick our winners, let's scale our winners, and let's recognize that, there's an opportunity that we have to seize. I got to say one more quick thing.
Go ahead.
The Canadian public gets an F. Okay, and I'll tell you what I mean about that. If we want to maintain the Canadian way of life, and we want social programs, healthcare, we want education, we want accessibility for the most vulnerable in our country, we need an economy that functions. And the Canadian public is not recognizing that. Sorry, I had to give the public a letter too on that. Sorry about that.
No, but I've put you all on the spot about the private sector, but total lightning round, because we have exactly 1 minute left. What is your grade for Canadian policymakers on this point?
Well, if I'm giving the public an F, I'm going to have to give policymakers a D-.
D-. You, Victoria?
Policymakers, I would say, I would give C minus.
I'm conflicted. I'm Rick Burke,
You can do it.
A for effort. I think that we need to go faster in creating
That's
clarity
not a
in
letter.
rules. And so
not a letter.
that's a C.
All right, all right. Well, thank you so much to our panel. I think we've learned a lot here. I think scaling, innovation, technology, and the courage to admit where there's a problem. So thank you. Thank you all.